Hello, welcome to Columbia Access Television's Studio A at Stevens College. We are here for the 5th installment of our Cat Chat series. We've had a really good run of things, and I'm really excited about today's show as well. I'd like to welcome to Stevens, and actually it's funny because Columbia Access Television has shared space for years with these people. This is Carrie Yost, who is in the Digital Film and Media Department. Did I get that right?
Yeah, close enough.
Yeah, at Stevens College. And Chad Freidrichs, who recently finished his last semester, or at least as far as we know, teaching at Stevens in the film department. So we've worked together a lot. The thing about the Cat Chat series is that it gives us an opportunity to have a long conversation and get into the career, kind of delve into careers of media artists. And Chad, well, I'll let you, we talked on our way over here, so I don't want to give away some of the little nuggets, but we're really happy to have you here. I know Chad's most recent film, The Pruitt-Igoe Myth, I'm sure many of you have seen. If you haven't, please check it out. I believe it's streaming on Netflix right now. And that played at True False. It's been on PBS, and that film in particular uses a great deal of archival footage. It's a documentary. But I think Chad, as we go through this discussion, will have things to say on many different topics than that as well. So this is an opportunity to have him talk about his career. I think that one thing with the Cat Chat series is that we want to inspire people to consider film and media arts as a career choice. It's really rare for people to immediately, know what they want to do when they're 14, 16 years old, applying for college, go to film school, and then go on to become a filmmaker. I think, from what I understand, Chad did kind of do that, but it's rare, and I think if you learn anything, you might learn some things to avoid, things to look for, and just learn about the particular journey of one artist. And Carrie's here to help us with that, an artist in her own right, so thank you for doing that. Thanks to the Missouri Arts Council for partial support of this series, also Stevens College for hosting us here at the studios, and the City of Columbia for supporting our mission. Also, thanks to all of you in the audience, and both here at the studio and at home. We couldn't do this without our members and support from the community. So thank you, and I'll turn this over to our filmmakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I'm very excited to have you in the hot seat, Chad.
Mm-hmm.
Because
I feel like I'm on a game show right now.
I know. You are, about your life. Because although I've worked with you for 5 years now and know you pretty well, I'm excited to find out perhaps what I don't know about you. And I definitely think you're one of the best kept secrets, not only just in Columbia, but in the independent film world in general. So if anybody can glean something from Chad's experience, it would be great. I feel like you're an independent filmmaker in the truest sense of that word, and you're one of the few truly successful independent filmmakers in that you have made a living off your films, and that's what allowed you to retire from teaching, for instance, and just make movies, and that's a pretty rare feat, actually. I mean, most people have to juggle a lot of different things, or they make a lot of commercials and things in between to really work on their films. And actually, I want to go all the way back in the beginning when you were a complete mystery to me. And it was like, who is this Chad Freidrichs person? I remember reading about you in the very first True False with Jandek on Corwood, your first film. And they think they did an article perhaps locally about that?
Yeah, the Columbia Tribune.
Yes, and I was like, how can I not know this person? Because at that time, the independent film scene was rather small in Columbia, Missouri. I thought we all knew each other. There were maybe on our hands, we could count them. And then out of nowhere, somebody makes this feature-length film that's pretty awesome. And then I got to know you from there. So I wondered, where did you get Jandek from? If I remember from that article, one of your main motivators was to make a feature-length film by the time you were 30? Is that true? 25, oh.
Okay.
All right. Of course, because you're ambitious.
So, well, I mean, that story actually takes me back to the very early days of my high school career. How I got into filmmaking was I saw a film called JFK by Oliver Stone, and that really inspired me. It was the first time that I saw a film that where I recognized that there was a filmmaker there. Like, I'd always just assumed that films kind of came from somewhere. You know, you never really thought about like film as something that you could do for a career. And so I saw JFK, was deeply inspired, and wanted to make movies. I just said, well, I'm going to be a filmmaker now. And so this is about my sophomore year in high school. And so what I did was I bought this giant book, and they don't have these books so much anymore because of IMDb, but there used to be this book called the Video Hound's Golden Retriever. It's like this big red book. Or yeah, every year they'd have a different color. And so just this huge book, and every single film was listed in it. And in the back, they had an appendix of all the 4-star, 4-bone films. And so I would just go through each of those and like look at them because I was very curious. That was the first time that I'd ever thought of film from kind of an evaluative perspective, like as opposed to something that was just entertainment, something where you can actually determine this is a great work of art and here's why. And so I was going through all of those 4-star films, and one of them came up, and it was Citizen Kane. And in the list, or in the description of Citizen Kane, it said, considered by many to be the greatest film of all time. And so I was like, okay, cool, I gotta see Citizen Kane. And so like, at the time, it was very difficult to find those kinds of films in the video store, old films, art house films. And so I'd have to travel like 20, 30 miles from my home in order to go see them. I never could find Citizen Kane until I found one at a copy at the public library. And of course, everything was built up on Citizen Kane. I'm gonna see Citizen Kane for the first time. And so I watched Citizen Kane and didn't like it. It was boring. Right, of course, right? I mean, you built it up way too much. But what that did for me was it made me, number one, appreciate that there were alternative opinions out there that I needed to try to, in some sense, to replicate or to try to achieve on my own, right? To understand why Citizen Kane is considered a good film. And then secondly, it gave me a kind of template for how I thought my film career should progress, and the template was Orson Welles. So I was going to live up to Orson Welles' achievement. He made Citizen Kane when he was 25 years old, and so thus that's how. And I made this deal with myself when I was, I guess, 16 years old, something like that. I said that I'm going to make a feature-length film. It may not be Citizen Kane, but at least it's a feature-length film by the time I'm 25. And so, round about 23 years old, I had not made a film. I was working, making TV commercials, and I decided, well, now's the time that I need to start. I always thought it'd be a narrative film, but my friend approached me with this really great subject that was a music topic, all this mystery and weirdness going on. So it seemed perfect. I didn't know anything about documentaries, so I started studying documentaries, and then 2 years later, I had it done. In fact, I completed it the day before my 26th birthday. So.
And that's funny because having known you as a person now, I know like, well, Chad said he would do it, so it will be done. Yeah. But I do hope this is where you and Orson Welles diverge in your careers because, you know,
yeah,
although
right.
Touch of Evil was pretty awesome.
Oh man, F for Fake. I mean, he had some great stuff in the 60s and 70s, but yeah, no, I mean, definitely peaked early for sure.
But you know, you did peak early, like Orson Welles. I mean, Jandek on Corwood, and it's interesting that didn't come, like you weren't a Jandek fan. I think that's how most people end up in documentary film. Like, I really love the subject and I'll learn filmmaking to get it. That's feasible these days. Right. But you were like, I want to make a movie, and this subject approached me, or my friend did. And but Jandek, it's interesting to me because he's this mythical figure, and you have this kind of mythical figure through all of your films. I mean, and so Jandek on Corwood, and I think we have the trailer that we could show you, but this is a musician. I didn't know anything about this guy, by the way, until I watched Chad's film. I never heard of him. Not that cool. But he's this person who nobody's ever really seen, and they don't even know where he comes from. And so most people making a movie would not choose, you know, film as a visual medium. Right. They would not choose something they cannot see. So that didn't scare you?
Well, I mean, I guess it was a kind of beginner's ignorance. You know, I mean, I guess I didn't know. At that point, I was making TV commercials, and so the 30-second local TV spots, the visual always presents itself in terms of the customer store. It's always there. It's always present, or the pitch man on screen selling you cars or whatever. So that was never really an issue that ever came up when I was making commercials, and so I guess I didn't view that as a pitfall. And so when I actually started creating the film, that's all of a sudden when you realize, wait a second, I need footage. And so I think in a way I was very fortunate because it forced me to kind of be creative. It allowed me to not rely on prior models that I had seen in documentaries. Because most of the, obviously like experienced documentary filmmakers are looking for something with a good visual, and so most of the films that were available to me at that time were constructed with something that had a readily available visual. And so basically what I did was I just went on my gut and said, well, with the images in this film, I want to find things that look Jandekian. So it was more of like a mood or an emotion that drove the imagery in that film rather than something that was strictly literal. And I think, yeah, I like it. You know, I watched the film like 2 years ago. One of my students was showing it for film club, and I thought I'd hate it. I mean, it's always like very difficult to like review prior work, but I actually ended up liking it. It was okay. You know,
well, and when I say it's similar to Orson Welles, it's like, especially for a person who hasn't made a ton of movies, or most people would make short films and then grow up into features, but no, you took the whole thing on. And that had a pretty outstanding reception. I mean, and I think because of what you point out, it had this new vision. I mean, it was a different way of looking at film. And it's interesting too, because it had people trying to figure out the truth, which is so inherent to documentary film. But because nobody ever sees Jandek, you had all these interviews with people who are defining Jandek, but of course nobody really knows it that well. But what you really had that I really remember, I remember when I watched it, because I read this article and then I watched Jandek, and I thought, wow, what an atmosphere, like what a sense of moodiness in this movie that really came from an artist. You know, you created that moodiness. It had nothing to do with the subject, actually, and I thought that was really amazing, and I think that that's something you carried over to all your films. And I wonder if we shouldn't play the trailer for Jandek, maybe so people know what I'm talking about now. I don't know if it's ready yet, but
I think so.
If not, we can keep chatting.
So yeah, while they're getting it set up, so Jandek, he is a musician who over the course of 25 or so years produced 30 albums, releasing them all out of a P.O. box in Houston, Texas. And so our film documents not Jandek in and of himself, but the fans who have created this mythology around this guy creating really, really weird music. And so I'll get into like my kind of take on the film after we watch the trailer.
The longest running, weirdest, loneliest enigma in popular music is a guy from Texas who calls himself Jandek.
Jandek is not a rock star. He's completely outside the paradigm of rock music or any kind of music. Jandek makes Jandek art.
When you listen to Jandek, you really sort of have to evaluate what your assumptions are about what counts as rock music, what counts as good music. You have to think about music in a different way after listening to Jandek.
They told me about you.
My reaction to hearing about it was a lot stronger than my reaction to actually hearing it. I was much more interested in the idea that there was this, reclusive guy writing these songs that made no sense.
That effect comes across of somebody who's just a bit deranged, and add to the antisocial element and you think, well, isn't that the basic ingredients of a sociopath?
You are undeniably underground, and you are the king of it. I mean, you are the best at being underground of anyone.
This is like people's raw emotions. This is some music that captures the heart of someone without a lot of bullshit.
So if you're willing to trust your ears and your emotions, and you're willing to let something like that in other words, if you're willing to answer the door and open it without looking through the peephole first, then you can be a Jandek fan.
It was 10 years ago.
It makes me want to see it again, actually. Well, it's interesting, too, because I feel like the music scene is somewhat similar to the film scene in that there's something that you can't help but, it's a little bit pretentious because we love what we do and we talk about it a lot and geek out on it, and especially this film, it was so many films into one, which I think is also inherent in all of your work and especially every good documentary. But you have all these people kind of pretentiously talking about what Jandek means, and some of them acknowledge that, and it's very postmodern. And at the end of the day, you probably gave us more information on Jandek than anybody's ever known before then. And there's, rock docs, I think, always have a pretty valuable audience because there's people who love this, but I feel like what's inherently interesting in this film, you don't have to know anything about Jandek. Was that a conscious decision?
Well, I mean, perhaps in the construction of it. I mean, initially the goal was simply to create a film on an interesting subject, and I had no idea what the film was going to turn out like, and I certainly had no idea of the moderate level of success it was going to achieve. I just wanted to make something, you know. But in terms of the kind of like culling all of these kind of different ideas and making it for a general audience, when I was creating it, when I create a film, like any film, I'm always looking for like some sort of big idea that will latch the audience, kind of grapple the audience into the film, something that they can kind of take away, a big theme. And so like over time with Jandek, as we were talking with the subjects, a theme kind of emerged. So it wasn't something that you start off with, you know, and that's usually the way it works out, at least it's been my experience, that you start a subject because it's inherently interesting for one reason or another. And then over time it changes, the meaning of that changes to you as the filmmaker as you begin interviewing or researching or whatever. And for me, that film really became about how people interpret art when there is no artist present. So artistic interpretation in the absence of artistic biography. And the kinds of things that people put into, like everybody's idea of Jandek was a reflection of themselves more so than it was Jandek, right? Mm-hmm. Jandek was the feedback. And so that, in a sense, I think is how somebody, and obviously it's a mystery as well, but that in a sense is how somebody from a non-musical, somebody that isn't in tune with Jandek, you know, doesn't even think it's music, somebody may even not like the music, but just watching those people talk about this artist and the meaning that they've taken away from that artist, I think is something that perhaps draws people in. So I'm always looking for that kind of theme or bigger idea in the film. It's something that it usually takes time to find.
And I think it's interesting, how did you jump from, I'm making commercials, was this when you were at KMIZ?
Yep.
And now I'm going to make a feature-length film. And I feel like today there's so many resources at your fingertips. I mean, just by the internet alone, and like you said, I mean, I learned from books as well. Like you're like, well, I'll go to the library and get myself a book. And yeah, if you really wanted to see certain things, you know, even finding them was quite a challenge. And now, you know, the fact that we can stream your movies on Netflix right now and things like that. I mean, how did you go from that to this? I mean, it's a pretty astounding first film, and it looks very experienced. So were you watching other documentaries then? And were you, did you get a good book? Did you practice?
The books were okay. I never really found the books to be too helpful, and I think part of that was just because I did have a lot of experience from the technical side making commercials. And really, like making TV commercials, it was really valuable. We used to do these things called Mid-Missouri business profiles, where we'd take a local business person and put them on screen for a minute talking about their business. And it was, for me, a kind of proto-documentary style interview editing, where you're taking this person with a kind of spiel about their business and trying to condense that down into the most concrete, concentrated form, you know? And so that really is, that experience of doing that, I think, was more helpful than any book I ever read, just actually doing it on a daily basis. And so from a technical side, I think I was pretty much ready. It was really more so the kind of conventions of documentary. How long, for instance, like this is something that people don't think about, like how long do you leave an interviewee talking before you cut to another interviewee? Well, I mean, I started like watching films and I started timing them, and it turns out that most great films like won't go any longer than a minute and a half. You know, 30 seconds is typically like how long somebody will talk, but if somebody really gets into a good story, a minute and a half, but never longer than a minute and a half. And so those kind of things, you just kind of watch for those and like learn like how to transition from one scene to another with music, and just, you know, you just kind of watch it. I think that was probably a better, or at least for me, a better way to go about it than reading the books. I tried the books, but I didn't find them that interesting.
Well, I think, too, what you hit on is that you had the technical side, and I feel like that's what everybody's racing to now. But you mentioned that you just watched a lot of stuff, and that's what inspired you. And I feel like that's really the core of how people sort of develop what kind of artists they want to be. Is that how it was for you?
Yeah, absolutely. It was watching, and then using that watching as a way to, I mean, it sounds like I'm stealing people's techniques, but like lifting techniques, you know, imitating, you know, imitate. I mean, that's all great art, you know, imitation. So just, and in Jandek's case, it was Errol Morris. You know, a brutal ripoff of Errol Morris is what I was trying for. If I could have had an Errol Morris film with Jandek on Corwood, I would have taken it, you know. And so just over time, you know, you have different heroes for each film, but Errol Morris, I was just trying to imitate him.
And it's interesting because I'm a big Errol Morris fan as well. And when I saw Jandek, I knew that was probably your influence, but at the same time, it's distinctly something else. So I think, I mean, and now that I've seen several films of yours, that something else is in all of your films that we'll get to. The one thing that, so when I said that you had this outstanding success, this Orson Welles, in the world of independent film, to premiere your film, well, first off, you were the first film ever to screen at True False, but nobody had heard of True False then because it was brand new. But I believe it got its sneak premiere at True False.
Yep.
But then its sort of public premiere was South by Southwest.
It was, the US premiere was actually at True False. And then we played South by Southwest shortly thereafter. And we actually played in Leeds, England, and Cork, Ireland before that. And I didn't know anything about the film festival circuit. I didn't know about like the hierarchy that you're supposed to like premiere at a big festival or whatever. I was just happy to get into a film festival at that point. You know, young, naive, just like totally happy just to like, hey, we're gonna play in England. Do we get to go? You know, like those kind of things. So. Yeah, and it worked out great. Like it was something that like slowly over time, the film just kind of like kept on building and building, and we were very fortunate.
Did that film festival world help you in any way? Did that kind of add to your sort of toolbox? Or?
I don't think initially. No, I think I was in a sense either too young or immature or whatever, where I didn't feel connected to the people who were there. It's something now, having done 3 films, one of which wasn't as successful, and that I can really appreciate film festivals for what they really offer. And one of the best things that they offer for me now is the ability to connect with other filmmakers and just like talk to them and just complain and like what kind of deal did you get, like what kind of numbers, like all those kinds of.
You get audited on your taxes.
Right. Yeah. All those kind of like
secret conversations.
Yeah, just like the mechanics of being a filmmaker. That's what I love to geek out with now. Like whenever I go to a film festival, and I think. For some reason, I mean, I'm kind of an insular person, and so it's not in my nature to go out and seek out other people to talk to, but I find that it's a lot more palatable and even enjoyable now to do that at film festivals.
And it's funny, because I think that's what's made you a very prolific and different filmmaker. I mean, when I first met you and I was like, well, who is this person? Part of it was, we live in a small town, and we've all been kind of crewing one other films and sharing resources, and I remember going out and meeting you and Jamie, your wife, which we'll talk about soon, because she's been a producer on all your films. And you did. You lived in this other. You had this different world that was very. You wore white T-shirts, not black at that time, and this other thing. But what's interesting when I said that there's something similar to the music business, I feel like we're constantly surrounded by people talking about film a lot. And at the end of the day, documentary filmmaking is just a lot of doing. It's a lot of home alone in your pajamas until 4 a.m. It takes many years typically to make a film, and so the talk really subsides very quickly. And there's a handful of people who truly, I think, do all that hard work, and you're one of them. And maybe that distance kind of made you prolific and sort of made you create a style that, although you said you ripped off Errol Morris, I mean, that was really a tiny bit, I'd say, that you were learning. But that sort of made you, the reason I say that is you've taken a path that not everybody took. So I'll give you a good example. Jandek, you did self-distribution at a time, this is when the internet and business was just starting to collide, and what did that mean? And the hardest thing about independent filmmaking was distribution. I mean, everybody can make a film now, but still, how do you get it in front of people? That's very hard. And everybody thought, oh, the self-distribution thing with the internet and other ways. And you're one of the few people I know who actually did it successfully with very little models. So I've just seen you not really look at what's around you and just kind of trust your instincts. And then typically, you were right and many other people were wrong. So where did this plan to self-distribute Jandek come from?
I think it just came out of necessity. We didn't get a distributor.
Okay.
And
that's a good example that I think people aren't aware of, that everybody really, those film festivals, the goal is to get a distributor. That's success if you walk away with distribution. And even Sundance, with hundreds of films being premiered there, 1% will get distributors. So it's a really difficult goal.
And it's something that I'm, that's the kind of standard mentality, I suppose, is to go out and get a distributor at a film festival. But I'm really starting to reevaluate that. And that's how I went into Pruitt-Igoe with as well. But we had a really successful run self-distributing our educational DVD. There are other kinds of markets that I'd never really even considered before. And so, I don't know. I mean, with Jandek, it was just like we had to get it out there. We had a bunch of people going to our website wanting to know when the DVD is going to be available. And so, I mean, I always feel really bad whenever like I can't provide somebody with the film. Like I was like that whole time I was just like, I want to get the people the film. I mean, like the fact that there were 10 people out there that wanted to see Jandek on Corwood, that's really cool, And so ultimately we just decided, well, let's go ahead and like make up some DVDs, and you just kind of learn. You learn, and you hopefully keep the things that work, and you discard the things that didn't work so well, and over time you come up with a viable system. So and I'm hopefully carrying that forward with the educational on future films, like thinking about like what the potential educational audience for a film might be, and you know, still constructing something that is satisfying to me, but also like always keeping in mind like how it's going to potentially perform in the marketplace.
And I think that's the sign of a mature artist. I think at the beginning we're just so enthusiastic about our topic, we want to make this movie, but I think once you've done it a few times, you can see the end goal, and you have more of a goal in terms of seeing how you're going to reach your audience over time.
Absolutely, and like I've become much more conscious. I remember with Jandek, I was always very much fretful of how people were going to take the film, or like what it's actually going to be like to like see it screened by other people, you know, in an audience. So it was just a weird idea. And so like I'd never really thought before about like creating for an artist. Instead, like like when I was making Jandek, the whole time I was kind of asking myself, well, who's my audience here? My audience is Jamie. I was just going to make it for my wife. You know, if Jamie likes it, then the rest of the world will like it too. Now I'm much more, I still make my films for Jamie in a very, very real sense, but I'm also conscious of making a work of art for others, and I become much more audience-centric. And so when I talk about like the market, I'm talking about that holistically as well, like the audience's experience. I want to give people a pleasurable experience with my films, and I think initially that wasn't necessarily there. I just wanted to make my movies, you know.
And speaking of audience, I've just been asking questions I'm curious about, but if you guys have any questions or want to interrupt, please do. But if not, I will keep chatting. Well, and so what I meant, it can be a blessing and a curse to have such a successful first film. And I've seen this happen. I mean, it rarely happens, quite frankly. Most people hit their success much later because, quite frankly, they make a lot of mistakes in their first film that you did not. And the world was ready for it, and it had, you know, there's way more than 10 people watching it now. I think you even have a distributor in Japan, so there's all these people all over the world watching it. But it can also be painful because it's been such a magical ride, and then you go back for that second film and you realize that the stars don't always align, and it's really hard to hit that again. And so that brings me to First Impersonator, which I think is an amazing film. It didn't have the same niche probably that Jandek does and that same core audience. But it's such an interesting psychological film, which is this definitely underlying thread, I feel like, in all of your films, is these people that aren't that simple. Jandek was not a simple person. That's what made him a great subject. And definitely the subject of First Impersonator, Vaughn Mader, was not a simple person, and that's why we wanted to follow down this road. First Impersonator is a documentary about, well, why don't you explain it? You could do it much better.
Well, let me set up how we got into First Impersonator.
Yeah,
so we were on the festival circuit with Jandek, and so in one of those books that I was reading about being on the film festival circuit, it was suggested that you have to have another film lined up when you go.
I've read that book.
Yeah, Chris Gore, right?
Yeah, right, of course. Ultimate Film Festival Survivor Guide.
And so like I was like, okay, well I got to have another film idea, and so like this was 2004, and I was really interested in the election that was about to occur in 2004. And so I decided, well, okay, it'd be really cool to make a political film. And so what I really wanted to do was just, I had heard an NPR story about Bill Clinton. And he was the ex-president, and he was over in China doing these kinds of, I guess, corporate speeches for like Chinese pharmaceutical companies, like getting like paid $1 million to like do a speech in front of a Chinese pharmaceutical company. And like it seemed kind of unbefitting of a former president to do something like that. It just seemed kind of weird. And so like I was like, wow, it'd be really cool to follow around Bill Clinton as he goes on the speaking circuit. Of course, no access whatsoever. I made Jandek on Corwood, but how am I going to get that kind of access? But I was like, okay, well, let's do the next best. Let's do political lookalikes. And so the idea was we would follow around a George W. Bush and a John Kerry lookalike through the 2004 election season to see what their life is like. The idea was partly politics, and partly I wanted to make a comedy coming off Jandek, which is a very kind of melancholy film. And so, well, it didn't, I mean, and so this is...
It's a Chad Freidrichs comedy, perhaps.
Yeah. It's one of those films that, again, it turns out completely different than you thought. It took a very, very dark turn at a certain point. Our political lookalikes, who are people who essentially go to corporate events and do like speaking engagements, like kind of comedic speeches, they weren't really comedians. They were more people who happened to look like the president, and so therefore they were kind of self-trained comedians at the age of like 45. And so their jokes, I mean, weren't as sharp as, say, like a professional comedian were. And so the movie that I initially thought was going to be really, really funny, and I think most people, whenever they hear about the subject, they're like, oh, that's a comedy. And it turns out it was not a comedy at all. And so I think that's part of the reason we can get into like the kind of aftermath of First Impersonator. But if it's available, we can go ahead and play the trailer to give some people some idea of the kind of, there's two stories going on that are being told simultaneously in the film. One about political lookalikes and the other one about Vaughn Mader, this very famous JFK impersonator.
Which is just interesting because I didn't realize that, and I never would have predicted that JFK Oliver Stone's film was the film that made you want to be a filmmaker.
Yeah.
But there's some similarities and definitely your JFK obsession.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it an obsession, but it's definitely an interest.
Yeah.
It's definitely an interest, and it's something that, yeah, there's something about that whole story and the loss of innocence and all those kind of like ideas, and I don't know how true that loss of innocence idea is or whatever, but like there's just something about it that's just very beautiful. So, yeah, so First Impersonator trailer, is that ready?
After he was caught, I didn't get a single call from anybody.
He's going to be like Clinton. He's not going to die out.
Is that right? I've been thinking that maybe they're just a has-been, but who knows?
And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our once and future President of the United States, George Bush.
Election night of 2004, I had a job riding on the line, and it was something I couldn't really control. My vote was 1 out of 120 million, and I was really hoping to be able to continue with this.
For the past 3 years, there's somebody going around this country impersonating me. He's doing my act, and he's using my lines. Do not ask what this country can do for you. That's one of my original lines.
He did JFK when people didn't really joke about him in the sense of doing an impression of him.
First Family becomes the fastest selling record in history, the biggest selling record. Vaughn Mader is suddenly a household name. As Kennedy had triumphed, so Vaughn Mader had triumphed.
We were watching when Florida was called, and I thought, dang, I'm gonna get to play this for 4 years.
All right, come on, all right, you can do better than that. It seemed like they were considering us to be the actual people, like some sort of lost reality.
Her life choices trickle all the way down to me, and I would say to myself, you know, where did Teresa go?
I don't think he was ready for the profoundness of how the people viewed him strictly as the JFK impersonator.
He was thrashing, he was flopping around like a fish out of water.
And he just got crazier and crazier and crazier. And then he somehow spilled the beans that he was, in fact, Jesus Christ.
The rubbish one is mine.
I've never considered myself a terribly lucky or a terribly unlucky individual, but turning out to look like the President of the United States is a very serendipitous thing.
I mean, First Impersonator strikes me as, I mean, like all your films, so many things into one, but Vaughn Mader really took us from that JFK time all through the counterculture movement with his life path. And then all the First Impersonators, when you know, I laughed when you said it was a comedy, but I think you can see from the trailer really quickly why it's not a comedy. It's a comedy for like the first few minutes when you're like, that guy looks like Saddam Hussein. Yeah. And then, but then you hear him, I mean, you almost see it almost seemed ahead of its time now where people do get their 15 minutes of fame and capitalize on it, and then that's really kind of an empty kind of feeling, and then what does that mean to them? And I think we're still trying to figure that out, actually.
Yeah, it was something that I did not expect the kind of depth of emotion to be attached to a particular job. And it became, like, ultimately for me, a movie about losing one's job in a way that you had no control over it, you know? Like, these characters, you kind of get involved with it, and then you get the kind of, a lot of the political lookalikes would have these very kind of intense reactions to being a star. You know, they would go up, they would get to perform, and then people would like them for a little bit and they come up and they chat, and then to give all that up mid-career, I mean, a lot of these people just like gave up their jobs to go do this, to pursue this new kind of career. And so to have that career ride on something that you have no control over, that is the American presidential election, was something that I did not expect going into it, you know. It was, and that's something that very deeply affected Vaughn Mader on a very, like, on a psychological level. I mean, the man fell apart after he lost that JFK gig. And he was never really able to recapture his own sense of oneself, you know? And so, yeah, that's how a comedy turns into a tragedy is.
And it's really interesting because then we're watching them. I mean, it's just this completely, you know, it's just a very interesting film in terms of identity and who you are and versus how the world constructs who you are and what that leaves you feeling. And I feel like actually I'd love to see it again today because I think it'd have even slightly different, I feel like that's something as a culture we're really trying to figure out now, especially in the world of social media. Now we're not maybe you and I so much, but certainly my 13-year-old stepdaughter and other people live in a different world where they're trying to figure out who they are on a regular basis, this person in front of people, you know. So I feel like, but the reception wasn't the same as Jandek, and I think part of it just simply that it was a little bit misunderstood, quite frankly, or maybe it's the fact that it was linked to an election and those kind of have a certain timing that we expect to see those. What's your take on it? It's a pretty amazing film.
I've never really figured that one out. I mean, it could be that the characters are in some sense unsympathetic. I've learned a lot working with our students at Stevens about the importance of constructing sympathetic characters and how audiences relate to those characters. And perhaps there's a little bit of that, timing, and I think a lot of it has to do with expectation. You know, when you hear about a movie that is about political lookalikes, it's got to be a comedy, and you know, if it's not, it's going to leave people just like, huh?
But going back to expectation, actually, had this been your first film, it would have been a phenomenal accomplishment.
Yeah,
I mean, it had a great reception. It had, you know, the kind of reception many filmmakers have. It's just that Jandek had this kind of skyrocketing whirlwind ride. And I guess, did you expect that again by nature?
Yes.
Or, okay.
I thought it happened every time. I thought you make a film and then everybody, oh, hey, great, that's, you know, and then it just sells a lot of DVDs and everything's great. But yeah, it was, I mean, the one thing I was very conscious of going into that was I did not want a sophomore slump. And it was a sophomore slump, at least in terms of how it performed. Now, I haven't watched that film in probably 4 or 5 years now, like all the way through. I mean, I have no interest in watching it. I'm kind of a little bit, not really, but like a little bit kind of bitter towards it, that whole experience, because all the success that we had taken from Jandek, we put that into First Impersonator, and it was just like, fizz, silence, you know, and that was just a very difficult thing to take, you know, and so it took me like, well, I mean, it took me 5 years to make another one after that, and I think there's a kind of hangover after First Impersonator that was kind of stuck with me.
Do you think it made you a better filmmaker, though?
Yeah,
or artist in general, perhaps?
I think that one of the things and when I watch First Impersonator again, I'll kind of revisit it, but I think one of the things that perhaps was a reason that First Impersonator didn't do as well as it could have was I didn't take into account my audience as much as I should have. I should have given them a little bit more pleasure, a little bit less pain. And so I was very cognizant of that with Pruitt-Igoe and almost entirely because I was teaching. You know, I taught for 5 years at Stevens, and in that process you see the students making mistakes, you see the students in some sense triumphing. And so you learn to figure out, and you have to enunciate to them, like, what's gone wrong here. And 90% of the time, it's not a technical thing. It's really not. It's a story thing. It's a character thing. And just having to say that over and over and over again, you know, you learn. And so I think more than anything else, it was my time at Stevens that kind of changed my viewpoint.
I think that's definitely, they say, you know, that you learn everything the best once you have to teach it, and I definitely understand why now. And it's amazing how, you know, you can turn around and explain all this to a group of people, then go back and make the same mistake that you just told your student not to make. And I think teaching really gets that out of you eventually.
Absolutely.
Yeah. You know, feel free to interrupt, please. All right.
Chad, I have a couple of questions I think that are connected. And I haven't had a chance to see The Impersonator, but I've seen Jandek and Corwood and Pruitt-Igoe. And I've just listened to you talk a little bit about not knowing what the story is as you start. You wait for the big idea to come out. Well, in seeing those two films, it's still a mystery to me where you are in it. Whether you're just interested in the story or you've got a meaning to communicate that's similar between those films. So there's kind of a question. But the other thing is you're really good at establishing mood in a film through music and images. And I'm wondering what the connection is between the mood you establish and the meaning that you're trying to communicate to the audience.
Yeah.
So I think is that a question? I
yeah,
hope so.
Totally. That's a great question, Phil. Thank you. Let's see. So in terms of like kind of an overarching theme or interest that I see connecting all of the films, I don't know. I mean, I think those kinds of concerns, like the idea of developing like a personal style or a kind of thematic coherence to all of your films, that's something that interested me a lot when I was in college before I actually started making films. Once I started making films, I was much, much more interested in just getting this one done right. You know, and so like, and that, I think part of that comes from like the fact that my background was more film analysis or film criticism, and like film criticism is always looking for those kinds of coherences to a filmmaker's career, and so now, I don't know, it's just whatever happens to interest me at the time is what I make a movie about, and the themes are things that I just kind of draw from the subject. It's almost like I learn from my subject. I think that's the best way to put it. I learn about the world by making a documentary. And so I think that if I were to like go into it like trying to enunciate a particular theme, I would be in some sense unfaithful to the truth of the subject. And then what was the second?
Well, just the connection between
mood, right.
The mood you establish and whatever the meaning might be that you want to communicate to the audience. Because now again, I haven't seen The Impersonator, but just from the trailer, there's a dark atmosphere as far as the soundtrack is concerned, and even the style of footage, and that seems to be a thread that runs across all three. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you're trying to communicate through that.
I think this. I mean, you could. I mean, not that I'm conscious of when I'm constructing the film, but then I mean, you could say that it's coming from some other place. You know, like like some sort of artistic well inside you that's springing forth. I have no idea. But the mood really comes from thinking about people's lived experience and trying to convey that to the audience. I guess that's what I'm trying to do in something like Pruitt-Igoe or in something like, especially for some person, ironically, is probably the darkest of my films. And it comes out of thinking about how these people experience their lives. You know, and then projecting that onto especially the soundtrack. I mean, so much of it comes from the music. I always tried to, with my students, play down the importance of music because they'll just become over-reliant on it. All you gotta do is slap down a good music track and all of a sudden it's amazing. But, I mean, really, music, when it's used well, can completely and utterly, and when it's used poorly as well, can completely and utterly dominate a film. So I think it comes from perhaps a musical preference for those kinds of pieces that are kind of dark and moody and whatever. But I don't know. I mean, in terms of the meanings that I'm trying to convey, that largely comes from the subject. In terms of the mood, it comes from the people's personal reactions. And then finding a kind of synthesis of those two, I guess, is the real trick. So, yeah.
And I feel like when people get into documentary filmmaking, like I said, typically they're really passionate about a subject, which is great. It's like people who never thought about being filmmakers before, and then they become filmmakers through this message they have to get out. And then I feel like, and that's all about access then, really. And then I feel like there are documentary filmmakers who make sense of a world that we can't make sense of. They take all this information in, and they'd be really great long-form journalists. We've talked about this before. They're excellent researchers. It's interesting documentary. We don't have to cite our sources necessarily or anything like that, and people have to trust us. But there's a handful of filmmakers who are so good at taking all of that in and putting it together in this package. I mean, it's funny because in the real world, you're known for your technological geekiness that we'll get into in a certain way. But I'm so glad that we're talking about story, because at the end of the day, like that's what you need to tell a story. But it's the story that makes films really amazing, I think really amazing filmmakers. And so all of your films really have taken all this in and sifted through us and presented to us what we should know. And Pruitt-Igoe especially, that's your most recent film, and I think one of the reasons, first off, you're a more experienced filmmaker and that's come through, but also it's possible that we've not been right. Like history, just because it says it's so, and I think anybody who reads history, if you've ever, I mean, look at a 1950s history book for a child, and it's pretty hysterical, actually, what we were so sure we were right about. But you really took a subject that needed to be addressed, and yet nobody would have. I mean, to this day, nobody would be talking about it if you hadn't made this movie. And you went down this road where everybody was saying this, and then you realized that's not the case. So do you want to talk me through how you got into Pruitt-Igoe? I remember really you telling me how excited you were in the very beginning and the path that you went down.
Yeah. Well, I got into Pruitt-Igoe. It's a film, most people encounter Pruitt-Igoe through discussions of architecture. And so that's how I first encountered Pruitt-Igoe. My wife and I were decorating our mid-century home. We just bought in our first house. And so we were decorating it in modernist style. And so while reading about modernism, just because I wanted to have my house faithfully modernist, I found Pruitt-Igoe in actually an audio lecture for the first time, and then I started reading more and more about it as this kind of giant failure of the modernist architectural project, as something that the built environment of Pruitt-Igoe, the architecture in some sense created a negative social reality. Right? And so here the idea of environmental determinism, the built environment around you will dictate how you behave. Right? That's a really interesting idea, and as somebody who's always looking for big ideas to inject into films or to extract, I suppose, from the subject, that was a big one. And so I was like, wow, I got to make this film. And related to St. Louis, I grew up on the outskirts of St. Louis, and just kind of have a natural sympathy for the city. And so that's how I got into Pruitt-Igoe. I was going to make the great architecture film about environmental determinism, I guess.
And for those of you who don't know, Pruitt-Igoe was the large housing that they made outside of St. Louis, public housing complex. So it's kind of like Cabrini Green for Chicago or something like that.
Exactly. It's a high-rise public housing project in the middle of the city. Large numbers of poor people living in it, a large minority population. So all the kinds of stereotypes that are built into public housing were there to an extreme in Pruitt-Igoe, and then a lot of social problems came out of it. So I think we're ready for the trailer, and that'll explain a lot.
These developments are run by the St. Louis Housing Authority. This is a far cry from the crowded, collapsing tenements that many of these people have known. Here in bright new buildings with spacious grounds, they can live.
It was a very beautiful place, like a big hotel resort, I'd say.
It was like an oasis in the desert. All this newness. I never thought I would live in that kind of a surrounding.
What happened? Well, one day we woke up and it was all gone.
We pulled up with the moving van. I knew at that point that it was hell on earth.
Pruitt-Igoe looks like a battleground. Vandalism and neglect have left fear among the remaining occupants.
In the middle 50s, St. Louis thought it had solved its low-cost housing needs, but instead a monster was created.
The experiment had gone terribly awry. It was just uncontrollable.
Pruitt-Igoe is such a symbol that we tend to forget that it is no different than the city that surrounded it. What happened to St. Louis was tragic, but that's simply not how we've told the story.
Pruitt-Igoe was always fighting against this terrible riptide of destruction in the midst of an economy that was dying.
The strong, tightly knit communities and families in which I grew up had begun to shatter, and it wasn't there. And it was one of the most tragic things I've seen.
It seemed to me that we were being penalized for being poor. That caused so much anger.
Persons that don't have a decent place to stay are willing to take these kinds of chances. Where we live, we're taking chances.
This is it. This is out of control, and we are no longer going to put up with it. We're not going to tolerate this anymore.
I'm saying, as tenants, we've got to draw a line and say no more. No more.
It's a pretty moving film. It's interesting because I actually think it's probably your most optimistic film, and yet from watching that, of course, it's not about an optimistic subject at all. But I think it's because the people in your film who finally are allowed to tell their own story, they've been discussed ad nauseum by experts and academics, have a very uplifting story to tell, even though it brought them a lot of sadness to live there. Did that surprise you?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I mean, I was going into this project with an understanding that we're going to make a story about this really awful public housing project. And so there are two avenues that changed my thinking on Pruitt-Igoe and public housing in general. One was academic research that was running counter to the kind of prevailing wisdom that said that Pruitt-Igoe was either the fault of the architecture or it was at the fault of like the social welfare state. The idea of like helping poor people was at issue here. I was doing some academic research, just reading up on articles, and there was a woman named Catherine Bristol who really challenged the idea that architecture was at issue. She looked at the economic context, the social context, the changing city in St. Louis, all these factors, and really presented a strong case that architecture had very little to do with what happened at Pruitt-Igoe. So that was the first thing that kind of was like, whoa, hey, here's a different story here. And different stories, taking something that you think you're familiar with and showing what's really going on is always a great way to structure a film. You know, and it's not something that I initially intended on doing initially, but you know, when I discovered that there was an alternative way to tell the story, I was like, okay, this is cool. Then when we started doing interviews with the residents, we wanted to get the residents' viewpoint. It's a viewpoint that has been largely overlooked in most discussions of Pruitt-Igoe especially. And so we started tracking down residents, and a lot of the stories we started to hear, I was expecting just like crime and violence, and all of our questions, you know, were geared towards that initially. But a lot of the residents were really reticent to talk about the crime and the violence, and they were really like, they wanted to talk about the good times. And so like after 2 or 3 of those kinds of interviews, we're like, wait a second, there's something going on here that we're perhaps blinded to, in some sense, that people in Pruitt-Igoe could live relatively normal lives and not have, weren't all drug dealers, didn't all constantly live in fear, you know? And so that interaction with the residents really educated me as to what daily life in Pruitt-Igoe was really like. And it wasn't, you know, it wasn't heaven by any means. It wasn't like a perfect scenario, but it also was something where people could live in relative normality, and that's what really prevailed in Pruitt-Igoe overall. And I think I think you're right, that's what provides that kind of optimism, the idea that, you know, even in these harsh conditions, these people are thriving.
And what's interesting is you really, you know, it's interesting, film can reach a far bigger general audience than academic research or Karen Bristol's book, of course. Right. And we'll take it as gospel, quite honestly. So this film came out, and I mean, I don't want to make it sound too grand, but you've really changed everybody's thinking on this. And what I really like is that, I mean, the reviews are phenomenal. So forget about the sophomore slump. I mean, I actually started writing them down, but there's so many, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. But what I was really happy about when I saw the reviews coming out is they really picked up on, I think, what makes that film pretty amazing, which they go back to the thesis, the story that you've constructed and the way you've displayed it tells such a pretty believable, you know, matter-of-fact viewpoint, but it's not what we have, and it surprises us about our own stereotypes, I feel like. And unfortunately, I feel like because film is an expensive artistic art form, we don't have enough films being made from people who have experienced poverty yet. I hope that changes. But really, I think that we haven't asked enough of those questions historically about why things are the way they are. Have you noticed that, you know, in your screenings? Has it really changed people's thinking about poverty issues? I mean, these things still happen today. I was a social worker here in Columbia, and they say the exact same things about our low-income housing in Columbia. Yeah, absolutely. It's their fault. They've created this, you know, that kind of thing.
This, it's something that, again, like I learned from the construction of the films. I learned about my world, and one of the things that I keep on seeing over and over again, I don't think it's like a confirmation bias where I'm just seeing it because like it's on my mind, like the kind of demonization of the poor that exists in our society. Like there was this thing about how there's going to be mandatory drug testing in order to get like state welfare.
I read about that.
You know, in like Alabama or something.
It was very recent, actually.
And just the language that people were using in that in the discussion was just so punitive in its idea of what poor people are like. And so like it's something that, having made this film, which is largely a film about poor people, it's something that I'm much more sensitive to now, and you start to see things differently. And like, that's the great thing about like being, I guess, a storyteller. In my case, it's through cinema, is how quickly a project can change your viewpoint about the world and how complex the world is. You start to see how complex the world is once you start delving into it, and these kind of simple answers where it's the architecture or the federal government or the fact that the poor people were somehow dysfunctional in some way. You start to see those kinds of things dissolve and see like how much more complex our world is, and that's really fulfilling. I really enjoy those kinds of moments where you become far more attuned, you know?
Right, and you know, I know you said that you were also getting over your sophomore slump, but I think you were so conscious of getting the story right, and because it did present so many surprises, and because it's a pretty explosive topic, I feel like that's part of the reason you spent time honing in and making sure that what you were presenting to the world was 100% what it needs to be. Don't you think?
Yes.
Like you needed that time maybe for a topic like this.
Yes, I mean, I was deathly afraid of making a factual error in the film. I mean, that's the last thing I wanted. It was just such an important subject, especially once I learned how much there was to it, that it wasn't just an architecture film. At that point, I was like, I need to do my hardcore research. I need to really think about this and really think about how I'm portraying people. That was something that I was very concerned with going into it. So I hope I haven't done any injustice in the film.
Well, and then what makes me happy, though, is that when this film came out, it's had a pretty remarkably overwhelming success. I mean, truthfully, it'd be what any documentary filmmaker would hope for all their films, yet we'd never be able to accomplish that with probably every film. And it's interesting how it did hit the world. I mean, you really were, I think because of first Impersonator, I remember when you were talking about where to premiere it and stuff, you were like, well, you really thought about that, and you thought, the people who believe in this film, if they want to show it, I want them to show it. So scrap all this idea that you have to premiere at this festival or whatever. And I feel like the best films of the year come out of consistent screenings where the ante goes higher and higher. And by the end of the year, the festival season kind of begins in January. By the end of that year, it had played all over the place and it garnered reviews. It's really hard to get a review at all about your film in a newspaper, and it's actually kind of the most coveted thing that any filmmaker needs. It's the momentum to their film. You can't even be nominated for an Oscar now unless you get a review in either the LA Times or the New York. And then that huge, I meant to bring it, but that huge spread they did in the New York Times, and it was not even just on the film, it was on the topic and the film and art. It was in the art section. And I just, as having seen somebody go through this 10-year career, it just was the most satisfying ride I've ever seen. I think most well-deserved. And there's some films that premiere at the festival circuit, and they're like, awesome, there's somebody famous in it, or somebody famous made it. And then it's like, eh. And then the one that really travels that way and then has the success you've had, has it been that satisfying from your perspective? It is from mine.
No, it's been great, and it doesn't seem like like I expected to kind of like die down after a while, and I think now it's finally dying down, but it was like we played the festival circuit and that was kind of like winding up in like August, and then all of a sudden like we find out we get a distribution deal. Like typically you get a distribution deal like your first festival or maybe the first 2 festivals, whatever, and we got a distribution deal at the end of this, just as when we were starting to sell these educational DVDs and get the film out there. And it just kind of kept on rolling, and then all of a sudden like we played in New York, and then I figured it would die down then, and then we get like another big review in LA, and it's just like it keeps on going, and it's just been it's been really cool. It's really cool to like, it's something I don't think I appreciated enough with Jandek, because it's the first one and because I thought that this just happens all the time. The idea of just people sitting there and watching it, like right now there's somebody watching it on Netflix, that's like really cool. To think about like somebody watching your work just around the world and getting it out there. And like it's great to be able to like move on to the next film now, right? But the fact that it's out there and it will continue to exist indefinitely in theory, right? That's one of those, it's like the Greeks, they strove for like a kind of permanence, the ancient Greeks, and the idea of like having like a reputation that outlived you was, in a sense, your immortality. And like, I love that idea of these films just kind of like circulating and they'll outlive me, you know. It's really cool.
And it's interesting too because you've really added to the dialogue of such an important topic. Not that Jandek isn't important, but it's not a social issue that we're all grappling with in the same way. So I feel like who knows who's going to be watching this 30 years from now in a class in some building. And then, so just to explain, I think a lot of people who are watching this are people who are new to filmmaking or want to go into films. You know, to even get into a film festival is really difficult. Thousands submit, 30 might get selected. And then when we say get distribution, that means it might play on TV or somebody will take over your film and sell the DVDs for it. But to get theatrical distribution, sort of the needle in the haystack or the eye of the needle to get through. And you actually accomplished all of those goals. So when I heard that First Run picked up, which is a very prestigious art house cinema distributor, and it's now being screened in theaters, it's very hard to make a documentary. Michael Moore is the only person who's been extremely successful at it from time to time, and get it into a theater, and it is now. And so I just want to say congratulations, because that's something that every filmmaker dreams of doing, and it's something I have to explain to friends and filmmakers constantly how unattainable that goal is.
Well, I remember going into First Run. I had a meeting after we'd gotten everything, and I was visiting New York, and so I just went to their offices, and like I was having a conversation with the manager, and I just remember confessing, I have no idea why you picked this film up for theatrical distribution. I can't imagine this film having theatrical distribution. I never thought it would. You're crazy for doing it, but good luck. And so,
well, luckily they have more faith in it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, they were right. They did a great job with it.
Well, it's you know, when we say it's academic, it's told from a storytelling perspective. So it's really it's a theatrical experience, and kind of like we go through, I think, that process of discovery as an audience member, like you did when you were doing the research. And I mean, only the best storytellers know just how much to give and how much to let people figure out for themselves. And I feel like people walk away really having to think about things on their own. And it's, like you said, it's really hard to not look at some of these issues differently after having seen it. So I think in that sense, it's not, I'm saying that if you haven't seen it, it's not this academic, extremely dry story. And I think that's because of the interviews that you did.
It's all the residents.
It's the resident interviews. So it wasn't until Pruitt-Igoe, I mean, I already thought you were an amazing filmmaker, but that's when I realized, wow, it's your interviews. What do you do for your interviews? What do you do? How do you go through that process?
Well, I usually talk to people on the phone first. And so I'll get some idea of their story and have some idea of the direction that I want the interview to take and kind of like what the person's function in the film will be, right? And so like when you're thinking about people in films, what you're really thinking about is characters. And I know that sounds distasteful. I mean, they're people, they're living people. But what you're actually doing with people in films is you're making them serve some sort of function. And so I'm always looking for that function for that individual to serve in my film. What kind of story are they going to be telling? What kind of arc will that individual have? And so then what we do is we just do really long interviews. I mean, 2-hour long interviews.
Okay.
2-3 hours sometimes. And we just try to, what you really try to do, and it's difficult sometimes, and what you try to do is you try to get a personal relationship with the person, not super personal, but to the point where they're willing to go back in time for you. And by that I mean they're willing to relive the experience in front of you for the camera. That's where you get the really genuine stuff, where people are recalling an experience that they had, sometimes an intense experience, sometimes a mundane experience, but it's an experience that they can see in front of them right now, and they're reliving it for you. That's how the great actors work, and that's how a great interview unfolds. And then a lot of it is like nuancing it and processing it in post-production as well. So it's not all what you see on screen. There's a lot of editing going on underneath the hood that people are never really privy to. It goes on all the time in every documentary filmmaker knows this. When people who aren't familiar with documentary production hear this, they're like, what? You're cutting it up, you're cheating, you know?
Yeah.
Like, and you know, I always just say that I'd never make somebody say something that they wouldn't have said in life anyway. But, and so like it's understanding how to develop a little section of dialogue and like extracting the maximum potency from that. So part of it's in the actual interview, getting people to relive it. The other part is just editing, cutting it down, thinking about how this is going to have the greatest effect. Ending with a punchline. You always end comedy with the funniest word, right? The word that makes the joke work. Well, the same thing works with a line of dialogue as well. You put that maximally potent piece right at the end.
And this is what I think that the critics really responded to. It's just such masterful editing and storytelling and in those comments, and they all work together. The juxtaposition of it all it's all collectively. And I think, like you said, as long as you're doing them the service that they were doing, then I don't think they're mad about that. I think they feel pleased to be a part of it. But it's a really odd thing, interviewing. It's very intimate. I think it's one of the most intimate things, and yet you're strangers, and so you walk away. And haven't you found that people tell you things that they don't ever tell anyone else?
I think people do open up on camera with the right kind of person. Some people shut down. But yeah, the really interesting thing is, like, I'll be interviewing somebody, and I'll see them for 2 hours, and then I won't see them again for another 2 years. And then I'll know that person because I've been editing them. And so I'll like walk up to that person and be like, oh man, and they've met me once 2 years, they don't even remember who I am or whatever, why I'm talking to them. And like you become, by editing somebody, you become so familiar with every single nuance, and you really start to like come to understand that person just by reviewing the footage over and over and over again. That it's a very unbalanced relationship when you actually come to meet them again. And some people are just very off put because I'm just like, I run up to them, like, hey, how's it going, Valerie, or whatever. And she's like, whoa, I haven't seen you in a long time,
But they were very pleased with this film.
I think so.
Yeah. How has the reaction been for you? Is it what you expected? Sounds silly, but for instance, the people in the film, what do they think about it?
I think that everybody, to my knowledge, likes it. Who was in the film? I know the academics liked it. I know the residents liked it. I think the residents were very happy with their portrayal, the way they come off in the film, and the fact that, especially with a lot of the residents, they were living in a place that over the years had become so demonized and so stigmatized that to have a film put at least somewhat of portrayed in a more positive or more nuanced light than just simply crime, drugs, etc. I think that that was appreciated. But yeah, it's really cool. It was so great. We screened it at the Missouri History Museum, and for like a bunch of people, a kind of big gala kind of screening, and a lot of the residents showed up. And Jackie, one of the subjects of the film, she's the woman who had 12 siblings. And so at a certain point in the Q&A after the film, Jackie's brother stands up and he's like, on behalf of me and my 12 siblings, and all the 12 siblings stand up, they're all there. I'd like to thank you for making this film. And it's just like, wow, those kind of moments are unreal.
It makes 5 years, of pretty alone work worth it, huh?
Yeah, really, yeah.
Yeah.
The thing is, like, I really enjoy those moments, and I really enjoy the festival stuff, but the thing that I enjoy more than anything else, and I know it sounds crazy, is just like me sitting alone in my home office, just like working through something. Like, and whether that be color, whether that be sound, whether it be cutting something together or just researching it and constructing a story. I enjoy that whole process. I enjoy everything about making movies. I'm just very fortunate to have found something that I enjoy so much, and that can lead to such like wonderful things, those kind of experiences and screenings where all those great things happen. But even if like my experience ended with the completion of the film, I would continue to do it indefinitely because I enjoy the process so much.
I think that's the sign of doing what you love. And I think because Chad's now not teaching at Stevens, so he can focus on film full time, the students here made a video for him, because that's what you do when you say goodbye to film school. And in them, they talked about what they liked about Chad, and one of them really summed it up, like, you're like a little boy looking at the world with wonder every day. And I think that's what every filmmaker needs. And especially if this is what you're going to do as an independent filmmaker. You're your own boss every day, so you better look at it with excitement and wonder and all of those things. But I think that's so true. Whenever I see you, you're excited about the next new thing. And what I want to talk about now, and if you guys have any questions, do feel free. But I thought we've talked a lot about story. What's really interesting to me is how much you really come up with your own methods of filmmaking, almost like from an isolated place of just studying things and saying, like, I think this would work. And historical filmmaking is actually the most expensive type of documentary, and that's why we don't have that many of them. Mostly we're going to know our history through Ken Burns now, I think. And that's that, because it's become, in the inner film world, it's very, very expensive to get the rights. If you're telling a historical film, particularly by somebody famous, somebody owns that footage, and to buy that footage is incredibly expensive. It's skyrocketed over the past 10 to 15 years, and it's something we won't really realize now. In our world, it's a very big discussion. But what that means is we're not going to know our history very well 10 years, 15 years from now. We're not going to have much, because nobody can afford to do it. But you have not not thought about that at all. But there was some thought into why you chose the topic you chose. But you came up with this whole system of making a historical documentary that's completely different than anybody else. And actually, you've made it in a very efficient, economic way. So I think that's a really good example of how you're just this logical person who's trying to figure out how to do something, that there might be a better way, and you trust your instinct. I mean, going back to that self-distribution, like you trust your instinct more than anything else. And I think it seems like that's made you very successful.
I think a lot of it, I mean, a lot of it is perhaps instinct, but a lot of it's just like necessity. You know, I mean, you have a certain end that you're trying to achieve, and so you find a way to like rig it so it works. And so like with the telecine, and so basically, one of the expensive things about this archival film is, of course, the licensing, but then there are like two other prongs. One is the access to the people that actually own the physical print, which often isn't the copyright holder. So there'll be like an archive that will have it, and they'll charge a fee as well, a very high fee oftentimes to use their footage. And then additionally, you have the cost of transfer, which in days of standard definition wasn't so expensive, but high definition transfer is something that's very boutique. And so like most distributors now, or most broadcasters, want high definition. And so you have to have high definition transfers of these old 16mm or 35mm prints to make it basically modern, to make it playable on TV. And so between those three, that's where you get that very large expense. And so we had very early on in Pruitt-Igoe a situation where we had maybe 80 minutes of footage that we needed to have transferred from the Missouri archive, the Missouri History Museum archive. And I shipped that footage off. It's 16mm footage. I shipped it off to Washington, D.C. to a lab to get it transferred. That lab bill for what would amount to maybe 3 minutes of screen time was about $3,000, $3,500. And that, on my budget at the time, was something that was just, I mean, we weren't going to be able to make the film the way we wanted to at that rate. There was no way. And so, like, really, this really is kind of a recurring theme in my career. What I did when presented with this very large bill, very impractical bill, was to get online and like type in DIY telecine. And a telecine is just a device that transfers 16mm film to video. Just what they would do on the East Coast at this lab. So I typed in DIY telecine, and it turns out there's a group of people, enthusiasts, who take these old projectors and rig them up to turn them into something that you can record with a high-definition camera. So they've basically made a homemade telecine, something that you don't have to ship off to Washington, D.C. and pay $3,000 to get transferred. And it turns out like there was this person who like had this model that he was selling for about $3,000 online. And so I was like, well, okay, well, my next lab transfer bill, instead of getting that, I'll get this telecine. And so basically what it is a projector. It's a modified film projector. And so I get this telecine in, and I start transferring some films that we had access to. But this is the kind of like turning point. This is the point where it switches in from something where it's like a practical necessity for Pruitt-Igoe to where it becomes kind of this weird lifelong obsession now that I'm starting to develop, that my basement will attest to with all these 16mm films. I realized that I have now the means to transfer these films. Now I just need to get my hands on more films, and I can do whatever I want if I can just get more films. And so I got on eBay, and eBay has just thousands and thousands of old 16mm films. And so that's actually where I started accumulating now I have like 400 in my basement, just old 16mm films that used to be shown in classrooms that are now viewed as junk, that go into an auction. You know, the schools sell it at like an auction, sold in lots, and then you buy them on eBay. And so now I have this method where I prioritize public domain films that are films that you can use for free because of the date that they were produced, or a couple of other factors. But if not, we also have a legal tool called fair use. If we're using footage in a certain kind of way, it allows us to use the footage without having to pay these exorbitant fees. So I have this relatively cost-effective way of not only transferring the films and acquiring the films, but also to legally put them in my presentation. And so that kind of nexus that was formed by those three strands really led to, at least partly, some of the visuals in Pruitt-Igoe. But for my next film, like, it's going to be 100% archival. And that's what I'm working on now. I just have all of these old educational films that I'm creating this history of science. I've been buying all these old science films off eBay for the past 2 or 3 years. And so I'm going 100% archival now. And the really cool thing is, when I started with the telecine, I talked to an archivist who we'd been working with in St. Louis, and she said, well, you can't do your own telecine. That's something that, it was like kind of magic to her, you know? It was like...
It was to everyone, I don't know
Yeah, no,
why.
exactly. I mean, because it sounds so technical.
Yeah.
It's like transferring film to video. How do you do that, right?
It must be dangerous. It
Yeah,
must be so sophisticated.
Exactly. There's no way our mere mortal minds, you need to have like some sort of, you know, like a lab degree or something where you can do this kind of transfer. It turns out it's extraordinarily simple. And all I had to do was just get my hands a little bit dirty, and all of a sudden you start to see there's nothing to this at all. And so like I've like continually kind of modified my little telecine at home, like trying to like get the best possible image out of it, just making small improvements, tinkering. And so that's become kind of my quasi-professional hobby that I've been working on for the past 2 years, and now it's leading to the next film.
Well, do you want to watch a clip from Pruitt-Igoe, or do you want to move on to your next film?
We can. Let's move on to the next film.
Okay, because you started talking about it,
Yeah.
the telecine, and the subjects, I'm so interested in it because it's hard to imagine it physically on film, and the avenue that you're going to go down. Like I said, I really love hearing you being so excited at the beginning and then watch you go down this road that always is unexpected. Do you want to tell them the premise?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I've been buying... Well, I've always wanted to make a science film. I love science. Science is like, I love reading popular science books. And so the history of science is something that greatly interests me, how science has changed over the course of the, 800 years since or 600 years since the scientific revolution. And so I was always looking for a scientific topic. But the problem was, how do I visualize this? That's always been a concern. Like, how do I find visuals for this? Well, the archival thing opened up a whole can of worms there, because you've had all these old educational films from the 40s, 50s, and 60s that were shown in classrooms that are in beautiful 16 millimeter, some of them in still great shape. And so I've always wanted to tell a story about the origins of life, like the chemical origins of life, how life, the first life form emerged on the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. What's a probable way that could have happened? And so that's what I started out with this project. Again, it changed over time. I started out with a story about chemical origins of life. I was going to visualize it with these old science films. And it became, over time, it turns out that story's been told before, and it became a story about the history of science, and specifically a story about spontaneous generation, which is an old scientific theory. What made spontaneous, so the idea of spontaneous generation was that you could have living life forms emerge from non-living matter. So you would have like decaying meat, and out of that meat would arise flies, right? So that was a prevailing theory about where certain life forms came from for about 2,000 years in the scientific literature, or pre-scientific literature. And so I'm going to be tracing this particular theory, the theory of spontaneous generation, from the time of Aristotle up through its ultimate refutation by Pasteur, the great French chemist in the 19th century, and showing what made it politically correct, I guess you'd say, in particular time periods, what made it gel with, what made it popular, what made it unacceptable as a theory, what made it blasphemous at times, and to show various ways in which thinkers have dealt with the idea of spontaneous generation. And this sounds extraordinarily dry, I know, but it's a comedy. And so
that's what I love when you tell that part.
It's gonna be this kind of,
everyone knows that debating the beginning of life is a comedy.
Right. So it's gonna be this kind of vast scientific history, but it's gonna be told comedically, because when you look at some of these old scientific theories, they're very charming and very sweet, and very funny. Yes, and very sure of themselves, and oftentimes you just like look at them scratching your heads, how on earth did they arrive at that? And they're kind of funny, but what I'd like to do is to like set up the kind of like comedy of like this weird old theory, and then show what made it plausible for them to think that, given their available evidence. So that's where I'd like to go with the next film.
Well, we have the telecine over there. Do you want to show them?
Okay, so
since it's the basis of your world right now.
Absolutely. So I have queued up here a film about Napoleon, and so Napoleon, Louis Pasteur's father. Louis Pasteur is going to be a character in the film. Louis Pasteur's father was a member of Napoleon's army. And so I have this film about Napoleon that I'm going to probably use. It's public domain, which means that I can use it for free. It was produced in about 1950. It's called The Napoleonic Era. It's got beautiful color. And what I'm about to show you here is how, essentially, this is how I transfer 16mm films to video. This is just basically a modified projector. There's not too much that's been modified. And we'll have a camera right over here record the output to that, and hopefully we can get it up on the screen for those of you who are in-house here. But I'll go ahead and start it up. If you can dim the lights here, I'll start her up and we'll get some sound. And I'll introduce you to an old Coronet film. And so this is actually being recorded by that camera. And that's how it works. That's a telecine. Right there. That's it.
Ah, yes. Looking at battle paintings in an art gallery. It is a pastime for me now, now that I am retired from the army. It is hard for me to believe that it is years since I saw my last battle.
Okay, as much as I'd like to dwell on that film and his remembrances of the Napoleonic era. So basically I have about 300 films like this that I've transferred over the past 2 years, and I've gone through them and kind of culled out of those the best 100 films that I'm going to currently be using for telling the story. It's not going to be just science films, it's going to be films about particular eras. So I'm really looking at like the Reformation and like late medieval period, Renaissance, up through the 18th century and into the 19th century where we've got footage like this. It would be very, to my mind, very, I guess you'd say claustrophobic to show a film where it's just images of like microbes, you know, like I want to make a sense of space and give people a sense of what the time was like as well when I'm showing these characters. So it's going to be 100% that comedy.
It's very, even with a few seconds, I can see the comedy.
Yeah, well, the one thing I don't want to do is I don't want to necessarily make fun of the footage. One strategy for using archival footage, one popular strategy, is to kind of play off the disjunction between our view of the world and, say, the 1950s view of the world, or at least the 1950s as it was presented in a 1950s educational film, which is always a little bit goofy. Right? They come off as goofy. And so a lot of films will use those old archival films in that way to kind of like laugh at them. Mm-hmm. And I'm not really interested in that. It's already been done before. It's been done plenty. I'm really interested in kind of laughing at the theory and then like having people, oh, how absurd, and then explaining it to them and say like, okay, well, it's not so laughable now once you understand what was really going on, like that kind of thing. And so it's going to hopefully be like entertaining as well as educational, kind of like Pruitt-Igoe, but like a lot lighter hearted is the hope. But you know, then again, I made First Impersonator with the hopes of it being a comedy as well, and that never happened.
Well, and this is a good time to say, if you're watching live now I'm sorry?
I think they're
if you're watching live now on June 19th at Ragtag Cinema, you're going to have a little taste of this feature film, maybe 5 minutes or so.
5 to 10 minutes. And if I get ambitious, I'll do 15. It all just depends.
And that might be nice to have a real audience come and see how they respond to this footage. I think that'll be exciting.
Yeah, well, I'm curious to see how it comes off, because I want it to be, I really want it to be comedic, and I've never written comedy before, and so it's something that I'm trying to kind of grope my way through as I'm going through, and it's something that I'll hopefully discover how to do well by the time the film's done, but we'll see what happens. I mean, I'll be able to tell pretty quick. That's a great thing about comedy is you can tell if it falls flat because people don't laugh, you know?
You know, after those First Impersonators.
Yes.
There's probably going to be information on the website. It's shown with a series of short films. I'm not sure what time exactly, but June 19th at Ragtag Cinema. That would be really cool to see. Well, what's also been interesting is hearing people on the festival circuit be so impressed by this telecine. You're becoming this wise sage, which you already are. In the film world, but now the rest of the world is starting to catch on. And I think it's really neat just because it's actually old school now, what they're so impressed by, you know?
Well, and the cool thing was for me, like, and the reason why I showed it was to show how simple it is. It's basically a projector with a shutter, a special shutter on it. It's just like a piece of metal. It's been modified, and you're recording it with a video camera. That's all a telecine is. And I think that for potentially future filmmakers, people are interested in it. Like the jargon and the kind of equipment that is available to you now is it's amazing, but it can also be very daunting. But it turns out most of this stuff that we're using, it's relatively simple. And I'm very glad I made the leap to be operating, to work on the telecine, because it taught me a really big lesson about like kind of diving into new things, and like the next film that I'm making after Pruitt-Igoe is going to be 100% based on that thing. And I would have never considered that before, you know? And like now it's opened up like where I have just an absolute wealth of footage that I've never had that problem before. That's a great problem to have, you know?
Yeah.
I've always had to struggle to try to find footage, and now I just have tons and tons of footage. And I mean, just like by trying out something different, trying out something new, like it led to like some really great things. So, you know, I hope I'm able to keep that in mind. I don't want to make all my films with the telecine, but it's going to be definitely like a tool that I'll be using henceforth for sure.
Do you guys have any questions? I feel like I'm not letting you talk, but I will keep going, actually. Yes?
Just with your inroads with this, are you on Errol Morris's radar? I mean, I'm sure he can afford probably to do it the way you were doing it, but do you know whether he's aware of you or aware of this?
I have no idea if Errol Morris is aware of me. I'm sure he has people who would. I think the telecine in and of itself is not the kind of linchpin to the system. Really, the linchpin to my system, like what makes it perhaps unique, is the eBay part. Buying these old films off eBay, like amassing a collection about a subject that interests you. I think that's the kind of game changer there. Is like just the acquisition of the materials. To be honest, I watched an Errol Morris film a month or two ago, and I wasn't too impressed with the archival usage. So maybe he could use some more archival footage. I don't know.
Errol,
but,
did you hear that?
But Errol Morris, fantastic filmmaker, love you.
Well, you have become, I mean, and I think Pruitt-Igoe is a really good example of that. It seems so simple, but the juxtaposition of music, sound, interview, whatever, and images, we know from teaching propaganda films in the early Soviets, but that's a pretty powerful tool, and it's not that easy to get it right. I think you're right, like about the cutesy archival, you know, it's really easy to hit on something quickly, but to really hone that into a feature-length film and make all of those images and sounds, you're basically reconstructing and creating something anew.
Absolutely, yeah. What you're doing is you're recontextualizing.
Yeah.
Like, that's like a remix, I guess you'd call it. I really, really enjoy that. And in fact, like let's watch a clip. There's a clip, Century the Self. This is one of my favorite filmmakers. So like each film has like a kind of hero. So like Errol Morris was like the first hero, and like my new hero is Adam Curtis, who's he's fantastic. Yeah. British filmmaker. Yeah, no, he's great. He makes these films about like big ideas as they travel throughout history. And so like this film, Century of the Self, it's actually a series of hour-long films that you can watch on YouTube for free if you're inclined. It's a great film. It's about how Freudian psychology in particular has been attempted to be used as a way to control the masses. I say attempted because it wasn't necessarily successful, but the idea was that we can use Freudian psychology to control people, right? Whether you're a government, whether you're an agency or whatever. And so his films are 100% archival. He works at the BBC, so he has access to the BBC's entire archive, just thousands and thousands of films. And so he just culls these clips from films, puts them in a new context, and gives them so much meaning by the voiceover and by the music and by the juxtaposition of that with the actual image. It's just so inspiring to me right now, and I'm trying, and I'll talk after this about like my new kind of approach to archival. But yeah, let's go ahead and play that clip.
This is the Institute for Motivational Research, a place devoted to the intriguing business of finding out why people behave as they do, why they buy as they do, why they respond to advertising as they do. And this is Dr. Ernest Dichter.
We don't go out and ask directly, why do you buy, why don't you? What we try to do instead is to understand the total personality, the self-image of the customer. We use all the resources of modern social sciences. It opens up some stimulating psychological techniques for selling any new product.
Like the other psychoanalysts, Dichter believed that American citizens were fundamentally irrational beings. They could not be trusted. Their real reasons for buying products were rooted in unconscious desires and feelings. And and Dichter wanted to find ways to uncover what he called the secret self of the American consumer.
All right, so just looking at those shots, I mean, I can't imagine where that archival footage really came from, these weirdly lit people sitting on their sofas in their living rooms looking directly at the camera. But there's something extraordinarily off-putting about those shots in the right context. It may have been like from a nice, happy 1950s movie that's just kind of lit a little bit weird. And then the shot that I really, really love is the shot of the popcorn. Because like, it's just like from like some like, hey, here's what it's like to go to the movies, have fun, you know, whatever. And then that's what it's like in the original. But when you put it with that music and you put it with the theme of his film, it all of a sudden becomes about the release of this human id as they're grabbing for the popcorn. They don't want to share the popcorn. You know, the brother and sister fighting over the popcorn becomes something deep and about their psychology. So that's what I'm talking about with like recontextualizing the footage and like creating a new kind of meaning. One of the things that I continually stress to my students is that images are, at their very nature, ambiguous. You can apply whatever kind of interpretation you want to it just by putting a new voiceover, putting new sound or new music underneath it. The sound is what really determines your emotional experience in a film, especially the music. And so what I'm doing now with films is, rather than looking at writing out the script first, and then going out and finding a bunch of images that will accommodate what I'm trying to do in order to tell that story. What I'm doing now, because I have such a wealth of archival materials, much like Adam Curtis, I'm finding the best clips. I'm going and just finding really, really cool clips, and I'm starting to ask myself, what could this clip mean if put in the right context? And so you see what you're doing there is, instead of something that is going to be very literal, where I need a shot of a dolphin here and I need a shot of a dog here, right? And I just go out and find the shot of the dolphin and the dog. What I'm doing is I'm basically looking at the footage and asking the footage, what is my story here, right? What's the proper way to tell that story? And then writing my script to match the shot. So then the shot becomes the leader. Right? Then you put some music underneath it, and all of a sudden you have this very coherent shot that looks like you almost shot it for your film, right? And what you've done is you've constructed a story around there. So I think in prior films, especially first Impersonator, where we use some archival footage, and then to a certain extent in Pruitt-Igoe, I've always been a seeker of footage after the fact. Whereas now I'm trying to, and because of the telecine, because of this whole system, I'm in a situation where the footage itself becomes almost like a creative informer of my process, of the creation of the film. It becomes essential to the construction of that story. And that leads you down so many creative roads that you would have never considered, you know? And that's what he's doing there with that shot of that popcorn. How on earth do you ever think of a shot of a traveling shot of people sharing or not sharing popcorn as something about the human id? You know, it's only by like going through all this footage and looking for interesting shots and then saying, what could this possibly mean, that he arrives at that. And so that's what's so fun and inspiring now about what I'm doing.
And I think actually what that shows, this evolution, is that filmmaking is an artistry. It's not as practical as everybody thinks, because the choices you make, there's all sorts of ways you can tell the story. And I've noticed, it took me a long time to realize, you know, honestly, a good story is a dime a dozen. And we all have all sorts of subjects we want to make. And do you get pitched at the grocery store sometimes? I mean, I do. And I'm like, well, you should make that movie. You
Aunts
know?
and uncles.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, but it's treatment. It's how you specifically tell that story that makes you a good artist or an appreciated artist, or that's what sets you apart. We could all make the same film and it would be so different. And what I think is interesting is that we've spent this time not talking about all the techie. You could make fiction films, and you have, and you're very good at it. And you can shoot your own original footage, and you're one of the best at it. And it's so interesting because people come to you for all the answers on all of that. But it's a reminder that there's all these different ways to tell a story, and there probably will continue to be all these different ways to tell a story. And that, of course, that would influence how we're telling stories. I mean, again, it's just a reminder that it's an art form. And I think maybe that's the difference between film and, let's say, broadcast. Because I think broadcast specifically is like, this is what we know to be true. Now I'm going to go find the visuals to tell you the truth. I already know the truth. I'm going to tell it to you. And I feel like a documentary filmmaker is kind of like, I have this hunch, but I'm not sure, and I'm going to spend a long time figuring it out. And you know, the images and how they go to, like Pruitt-Igoe, there were these really beautiful images. I remember you getting them, and it was like a gold mine, when the birds, for instance, and some of this footage that you found, and what any of these other pieces would have fit, but this is what it needed, and it seems so right there. And I feel like that's the artistry, and we often get stuck talking about practical stuff. Like, I can't believe nobody here has asked about cameras and what you edit on and codecs. And, but it's interesting because in the Columbia community, Chad is very much on the forefront of that, and in the film community. And I think that is one of the reasons I say that you're a true independent filmmaker. You're never feeling that something's beyond your attainable knowledge to know how to do. And thus, I think a lot of people are getting a little bit put off by the technology, and particularly the computer skills it takes. And a camera is a computer now as well, and we're saving to hard drives and all this stuff, and it can be daunting. And I'm one of those people that calls you with questions, but that it's really about storytelling. But I am curious, how do you stay abreast? How do you learn, Chad Freidrichs?
Well, in 10 minutes. In terms of the technology, usually what I'll do is I'll buy a new piece of equipment, and at that point I will kind of like find out what is state of the art and what is the best option. But so I'll use my tool for a little bit, and then I'll decide that I need to upgrade my tool, or there'll be a new tool that comes out that's even better or whatever. And so at that point I'll do research. And so like it's kind of sporadic fits. It's like I don't know what's going on with computer motherboards right now. I don't know what kind of RAM computers are taking, but the next time I have to build a computer, then I'll become very quickly up to date just by doing research. So usually it's fits and starts as needed, and that's just one of the benefits of just having like the equipment at your avail, right? I don't necessarily need to like be up to date on everything. I've got equipment that's satisfactory for most purposes right now. So just in reading the internet, like anybody.
It's amazing what reading will do.
I know. Yeah.
Well, we have 10 minutes left. Is there questions you guys have? One thing I thought of is that, I say that you're very independent, but of course you're not, and several people help you make films. And it's interesting, when I first met you and your wife, Jamie, it was really interesting to me that you're a team, and sometimes you see these teams, and you kind of have to be a part of that film because it's so engrossing that if you're not interested, boy, you'd spend a lot of time apart, or you wouldn't have a lot to say at the dinner table, perhaps. But really, over the years, I've seen what a well-honed machine you are, and I just wondered if you could comment on that. You're one of the few couples I know who make movies together. Yeah. And your skills really balance each other, I feel like.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jamie is our fundraiser. Oh, so Jamie's getting a mic. Jamie, would you like to comment on it? No.
Jamie's like, I did not know you were going to bring me up.
So with Pruitt-Igoe, Jamie was our fundraiser. So this is a film that was funded with a lot of grants. And so from the very start, we realized that we needed a fair amount of money to do this film. And so Jamie is a nonprofit fundraiser in her day job, and so she became one on Pruitt-Igoe. And as the film progressed, it became apparent that I was going to be writing the script. And with writing for documentary, it's something that I hadn't had to write a script before. It's something that we've always just had talking heads do it. And so, like any new thing, I guess I was a little bit unsure or nervous about, how it was going to turn out. And so, I instantly go to the person who I trust the most, and that's Jamie. And, we say, okay, will you help me on this, Jamie? Like, can you help me get this done? And of course, Jamie says yes. And so initially, it was difficult. I think that our kind of energies clashed at times, but we learned to work that out. And ultimately, like, that script is just as much Jamie's as it is mine, just like kind of working through it together. It's so good to have a partner on a script to bounce ideas off, Editing is really like a kind of solitary thing. I would hate to edit with somebody else, because I would be very defensive, and I'd always be like, I'd be like, hopefully like 2 steps ahead of the other person, and like they'd be like, oh, do this, and I'm like, I know, I was getting there, like that kind of thing. Whereas like with a script, when you're bouncing, and you're constructing a story and you're bouncing ideas off each other, it becomes so much more than what you could have come up with on your own, especially when we were writing Red Cloud, which was a narrative, like Cold War sci-fi thriller fiction film that we produced at Stevens College one year. That was so fun, like once we got into that, just like bouncing ideas off each other, working through the dialogue. She's really good at dialogue. And so having her help out with dialogue. And so, and then just like the general, helping out on producing tasks, but really fundraiser and screenwriter are Jamie's primary tasks, and those are like very welcome because those are the things I'm probably weakest at.
And so you had this goal of wanting to make a movie by 25. Do you still have these set goals that's driving you right now?
Not as explicit I would like to increase the rate of production. Like, for instance, I do have a goal. I'd like to produce this next film in the next year. So by March of next year, I think I should have it done. And part of it is like an experiment. I really view this next film as something, I mean, you may have like caught, and in my business of film class, I had my students like research like other films that are out there like this origin of science, this science documentary. And there's just nothing else like this. It's just like so weird and off kilter. And so I'm partly viewing it as an experiment to see if this telecine system works, if I can produce a film for relatively inexpensively, and if I can produce it very quickly. And if I can do that, then the film's a success. Even if it doesn't necessarily do well with audiences, at least I will have like shown that I can produce something that quickly so I can move on to other subjects. But outside of just producing that film within a year, I just want to increase my level of production, but that's about it. Like, I'm very content with the road that I'm on right now. It's just a matter of just pushing myself to get it done.
And I feel like facts are good for people to know, but like archival historical films typically are very expensive and take a long time to make, so you depend on these gatekeepers that have to say yes, and they don't do it in a timely manner. But just to give you an example, like a PBS historical doc would be about $500,000 budget. If it's really famous, possibly $700,000, and yours is much less. I won't force you to say your budget here.
Yeah,
but
it's in the tens of thousands.
Right, right. Yeah. And then the speed. So, you know, it might seem like a simple thing, but it's quite a game changer as far as, and I hope that's inspiring to people that even if you're not interested in scientific historical films, the fact that you want to make a movie, I feel like at the very root of all filmmakers are people who just want to tell a story and they figure something out. Like the Maysles brothers really invented our ability to have, you know, sound that's small and compact, and that allowed us to tell a certain kind of film because they wanted to tell films that nobody was telling. And you know, George Lucas invented digital video technology because he wanted to create a way to tell this type of story. And he actually, somebody said that he's a filmmaker because it's an ending well of things to know. And I feel like it'd be really interesting to see what you're doing 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because you definitely have that entrepreneurial, almost inventor spirit to filmmaking. And I feel like if you don't have it today, you better have a lot of money, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Because you just have to pay other people to figure it out.
Yeah, other people are very expensive, it turns out.
It's far more expensive, and that's why I think we've tried to teach, and I think most independent filmmakers figured it out. We're independent because it's so much cheaper. We don't have the luxury to be any other way.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I get frustrated when I talk to people who aren't editing their film because they don't have the money raised to edit it. It's like, but then why aren't you editing it?
Or sound or color or whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
But you definitely do all of those things.
Again, out of necessity. You know, it just came from like not having a budget on those early films and just saying, well, why not? You know, and like what that does, like whenever you're making a film and you know how to do sound design, well, that means that I can rely, I don't have to have the image track be so expressive here. I can rely on my sound. So it makes you a better visual filmmaker just by knowing what's possible with sound as well. And so knowing all of those things, and that's something that, again, like technology and repurposing of technology, old technologies and then new technologies, emerging technologies, all of those lead to new forms of expression. I mean, that's been the history of cinematic style from the very beginning. A new technology comes out, it leads to a new mode of expression. Citizen Kane was not possible without the technologies that enabled it.
And even Citizen Kane, they came up with a way of doing things that hadn't been done before, but mostly because they wanted to do it that way. Yeah. And so I think story trumps everything, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. And I say that because I think people who know you, you're such a smart, technical, scientific person. But at the end of the day, your films are successful because of the story. So it's really interesting that all this goes into it, and that's what they call you about. But it's always about the story, of course.
It is. It's always about the story.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time. And Carrie, you really hit upon something, I think, with all the people who have been featured on our cat chats. Like, I do want to see what they're doing 5 years from now. I feel like a lot of people here in Columbia are kind of on the verge of careers and starting off on the right ways. I mean, of course, you've had a lot of success specifically, Chad, but anyway, yeah, I think that's going to be really fun looking back on these cat chats.
Well, you should have me back in 5 years.
All right, it's a deal. I just want to remind special thanks to the Missouri Arts Council, Stevens College, Office of the City of Columbia. Carrie Yost, thank you so much, Chad. And I believe, unless there are any questions, we'll wrap up this 5th installment of Cat Chats.
Thanks for watching.
Thank you.